Welcome to The Explainer. Today, I am firmly putting on my historian hat, and we're going to dig into a genuinely fascinating 200-year-old time capsule. We're heading straight back to the year 1826, specifically to Bengal. Now, why this exact time and place? Well, because Bengal in 1826 wasn't just a spot on a map. It was the epicenter of this massive, unprecedented collision between ancient traditions and, quite literally, a ravenous global corporate state. This is the exact historical pivot point when traditional ways of life were just swallowed whole by a brand new colonial system. So we're going to reconstruct the mechanics of this society, look at the crazy paradoxes of how everyday people survived, and uncover how the hidden consequences of this specific year basically changed the entire course of global history. But before we get completely lost in the granular details of everyday life, we really need to tackle a pretty fundamental question. Who was the true ruler of Bengal 200 years ago? I mean, if you close your eyes right now and picture the Indian subcontinent in the 1820s, it's super easy to imagine a majestic local king, right? Or maybe a powerful Nawab holding a lavish, jewel-toned court. But the actual reality on the ground during this era completely shatters those modern assumptions. The reality was entirely different. And, it definitely didn't happen overnight. If you look at the timeline, by 1826, the British East India Company wasn't just some simple trading corporation moving shipments of spices and silks around. No, it had morphed into a fully militarized corporate state with absolute control. This was the result of a 70-year creeping takeover. It all kicked off back at the famous Battle of Plassey in 1757. And over those 7 decades, the company didn't just win a military conflict. They slowly and methodically devoured Bengal's political, judicial, and economic layers. By 1826, their authority was absolute. Okay, let's dive right into this because this top-down reality of power is absolutely fascinating. It left traditional royalty completely hollowed out. While the Nawab of Murshidabad still had all his grand titles on paper, the historical records show us he was pushed down to the absolute bottom of the actual power structure. He had zero real authority. He was literally just a figurehead, kept around for optics. The true, ultimate decision-making power sat squarely with the British Governor-General at the very top. That power was enforced by company officials and then managed on the ground by powerful local landlords. The company handled the army, the courts, and of course, the treasury. And when you think about the sheer scale of the territory they commanded, it's staggering, especially considering the absolute logistical nightmare that was the 19th century. The Bengal presidency was a massive geographical behemoth. We are talking about modern-day West Bengal, the entirety of Bangladesh, Bihar, Odisha, and vast stretches of Assam. To govern a territory of this massive size, with millions of people, entirely from one centralized capital city without any modern communication, that required a ruthless, highly organized bureaucracy, and every single bit of it was dictated from Calcutta. Now, what's really wild about that capital city is that Calcutta itself was a place of just striking contradictions. Literally streets away from the grand governor houses, the towering churches, and these massive mansions built specifically to project European imperial power, native Calcutta told a completely different story. It was defined by incredibly crowded slums, unpaved muddy roads that turned into impassable swamps during the monsoons, and evenings lit only by the faint flicker of torches. The architecture of the city itself was just a visceral, physical representation of deep societal inequalities. Yet, despite those glaring local inequalities we just talked about, Calcutta was an absolute economic powerhouse on the global stage. It was the vital artery for immense wealth flowing directly into Europe. Just the sheer volume of exports, silk, muslin, cotton, tea, and indigo made Bengal a world-class trading hub. But this sets up a deeply fascinating, though tragic, historical paradox. The East India Company was pulling in profit margins that modern global corporations today could literally only dream of. They were generating unimaginable wealth. But at the exact same time, the local population doing the actual labor was sinking deeper and deeper into starvation and poverty. How exactly did they pull this off? Well, the mechanics of this extraction are perfectly captured by a specific historical tragedy we call the Indigo Curse. At this time, the Industrial Revolution in Europe was booming, and that created an insatiable demand for blue dye for the textile industry. To feed this hungry global machine, the company literally forced local Bengal farmers to abandon their sustenance food crops and cultivate indigo instead. And the system was meticulously designed to be inescapable. Farmers were paid meager, fixed amounts for the indigo, but they still faced exorbitant tax rates. This resulted in generations of inescapable rural debt and daily oppression. This incredibly efficient exploitation was firmly locked into place by the Permanent Land Revenue Settlement, operating through the zamindari system. Now, instead of just giving you a dictionary definition of these landlords, we really need to look at the devastating impact here. Basically, zamindars were given absolute, unchecked rights to collect taxes on behalf of the British. And the historical record reveals a pretty grim reality. Many of these landlords were entirely indifferent to whether the peasants actually survived. Even if there was a devastating flood or a total crop failure, it didn't matter. The rigid taxes still had to be paid, which systematically ruined the peasant class.
And the devastation went far beyond just the agricultural fields. When we dig into the colonial records regarding Bengal's centuries-old, globally renowned artisan economy, we see a total, tragic collapse. For generations, Bengal's textiles were considered absolute luxury items all over the world. But by 1826, traditional handloom weavers were facing total ruin. They simply could not compete with the flood of cheap, machine-made industrial goods pouring in from the massive factories of Manchester and Birmingham. The crazy irony here is that the very industrial revolution that demanded their indigo was simultaneously destroying their traditional crafts.
And this brilliantly illustrates the human cost of that economic shift. Think about it. This wasn't just a change in corporate ledgers. It forced a massive, tragic human migration. Highly skilled artisans with centuries of proud heritage, weavers, blacksmiths, potters, goldsmiths, they were entirely displaced. Stripped of their livelihoods and unable to compete with British factories, they were forced out of their workshops. These proud masters of their craft were reduced to desperate day laborers, or had to join the impoverished farming class, or just outright face starvation. It completely shattered the traditional rural social structure. To truly understand how this was allowed to happen, we kind of have to strip away our modern perspective and anchor ourselves to what daily life actually felt like. 1826 was a world moving at a completely different pace. There were no trains. There were absolutely no telegraphs for instant communication. The immense suffering we just discussed was largely hidden by profound geographical isolation. The true lifelines of the society were the rivers, like the Ganga and the Padma. Travel and news moved agonizingly slow by boat or mud roads. For the vast majority, you lived by the rhythm of the sun, and you found solace in evening traditions like kirtan and local folk theater. So, here's the crucial point. When we sift through all these colonial records, the hollowed-out power structures, the displaced artisans, the crushing rural debt, you have to ask, was everything just darkness and exploitation? It's incredibly easy to assume that a deeply traditional society under the strict grip of a corporate monopoly was just completely frozen in misery. But as we historians know, history is rarely that simple. Let's move to the next logical phase of our explainer and see how all this pressure actually builds into something entirely unexpected. Right in the midst of this deeply challenging period, a new dawn was breaking. In and around Calcutta, a small but fiercely intellectual group of educated individuals began doing something highly dangerous and revolutionary. They started questioning the societal darkness. They actively challenged the deeply conservative norms, the strict social rules, and the superstitions of their own culture. It was the spark of a new awakening. Standing at the absolute forefront of this cultural awakening was an exceptional thinker, Raja Rammohan Roy. In 1826, he acted as a massive disruptive force, in the best way possible. In a society bound by incredibly strict, centuries-old rules, his ideas were radically controversial. He loudly championed English education, pushed for a rigorous scientific temperament over blind faith, and fought fiercely for radical social reform. He was literally planting the seeds for the movement that would eventually, successfully, ban the brutal practice of sati. He was a real game changer. Now, you might be wondering, how did progressive thinkers like Ram Mohan Roy even emerge in this environment? Well, this highlights one of history's most delicious ironies. See, the British East India Company desperately needed an army of local clerks to help manage their massive bureaucracy. To get them, they established English schools and colleges in Calcutta. But by educating the locals to be obedient administrative cogs in their machine, the British inadvertently funded and created a highly sharp intellectual middle class. This exact group would ultimately become the leaders of the Bengali Renaissance and eventually the architects of the empire's downfall. So when we synthesize all these historical records of 1826, we can see that Bengal functioned simultaneously as three massive, distinct forces. First, it was a European gold mine, systematically stripped of its immense wealth to fuel foreign industrialization. Second, it served as a political laboratory where the British tested, refined, and perfected the very mechanics of modern colonial bureaucracy. But third, and absolutely most crucially, it was a preparation ground. It was a society being actively primed for a massive ideological revolution. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought to ponder. How does the darkest period of exploitation actually plant the seeds for future independence? The intense economic pressures, the shattering of the old rural world, and the ironic introduction of a new educational system in 1826, these very struggles acted as a crucible. They forged the new ideas, the resistance, and the early whispers of nationalism that would eventually rise up and entirely change the history of the modern subcontinent. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope this changes how you view the foundation of the modern era. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.